You're sitting across from someone at coffee, and mid-sentence they pause, look away, and you hear them whisper something under their breath to themselves, working through a thought out loud, and most people would find this odd, maybe even concerning. But what you're actually witnessing is a sign of high intelligence and strong cognitive processing. Or maybe you have that one friend who tells you everything. I mean everything. The intimate details of their relationship, their financial struggles, their family drama, all on the second or third conversation. And you've wondered why some people have no filter while others are locked vaults. We move through life collecting observations about human behavior, noticing patterns, filing away little psychological facts. But most of us never stop to really understand what these behaviors mean, what they reveal about the inner workings of the human mind, what they tell us about trauma and healing and the invisible architecture of personality. And once you start understanding these psychological facts, once you begin to see human behavior through this lens of deep pattern recognition, everything changes. The world stops being a random collection of weird people doing inexplicable things and becomes a rich tapestry of psychological cause and effect, of coping mechanisms and survival strategies, of wounded children living inside adult bodies, trying their best to navigate a world that often makes no sense. So let's dive deep into 35 psychological facts that reveal human behavior in ways that most people never notice. And I promise you, by the end of this, you'll never look at people the same way again. Let's start with that first one. The one that probably makes you uncomfortable if you've ever caught yourself doing it. If someone talks to themselves, they're not losing their mind or showing early signs of mental instability. They're actually demonstrating higher cognitive function and better problem-solving abilities than people who don't engage in self-talk. Research in cognitive psychology has consistently shown that people who talk to themselves, either out loud or in their heads, perform better on tasks requiring focus, memory, and complex reasoning. When you verbalize your thoughts, you're essentially creating an external feedback loop that helps your brain organize information more effectively. You're taking abstract thoughts and giving them concrete form through language, which activates multiple areas of the brain simultaneously and creates stronger neural pathways. Studies have found that children who engage in self-talk learn faster and retain information better, and this advantage continues into adulthood. When you talk yourself through a problem, when you verbally process your options, when you narrate what you're doing as you do it, you're not being weird, you're optimizing your cognitive performance. Athletes use self-talk constantly to improve performance and maintain focus. Surgeons talk themselves through complex procedures. Writers and artists narrate their creative process to themselves. This isn't madness, this is mastery. From a deeper psychological perspective, self-talk is also a form of self-regulation and self-soothing. When you talk to yourself, you're essentially parenting yourself, providing the external guidance and reassurance that you might have received from a caregiver as a child. People who had attentive, verbally engaged parents often internalize that voice and continue the dialogue with themselves as adults. But even people who didn't have that experience can develop healthy self-talk as a way of meeting their own emotional needs, of being their own cheerleader and coach and companion through life's challenges. Now let's talk about something that reveals a lot about attachment history and early relational trauma. If women don't make friends easily, if they struggle to form close bonds with other women, if they describe themselves as not being like other girls or preferring male friendships, this is often, not always but often, a red flag that points to deeper psychological issues around trust, competition, and feminine identity. Before anyone gets defensive, let me be clear. This isn't about judging women who have mostly male friends, or who've had difficult experiences with female friendships. This is about understanding the psychology beneath the pattern. Women who struggle to connect with other women often experienced one of several things in their developmental years. They might have had a mother who was critical, competitive, or emotionally unavailable, which created an unconscious association between femininity and danger or rejection. They might have been bullied or excluded by girls during the crucial middle school and high school years, when female social hierarchies are being established and female friendships are being practiced. They might have internalized misogynistic beliefs from their family or culture that taught them that women are dramatic, untrustworthy, or less valuable than men. Or they might be carrying unresolved competition wounds, a sense that other women are threats rather than allies, rivals for male attention or social status rather than potential sources of support and connection. The phrase, "I'm not like other girls" is particularly revealing because it suggests a need to distinguish oneself from femininity itself, to claim special status by rejecting association with the feminine collective. This often comes from a place of internalized misogyny, where a woman has absorbed the cultural message that femininity is weak or inferior, and has decided to survive by aligning herself with masculinity instead. The healing work here involves examining these beliefs about women and femininity, grieving whatever wounds caused the disconnection in the first place, and learning to see other women not as competitors or threats, but as potential allies, mirrors, and sources of profound connection. Female friendships, when healthy, offer a type of intimacy and understanding that's different from romantic partnerships or male friendships, a space where women can be fully seen in their femininity without having to perform or protect or prove anything. E eu preciso pausar aqui por momento e te fazer uma pergunta. Quantos desses fatos você já reconheceu em você mesmo ou nas pessoas ao seu redor? Você já parou para pensar no que esses pequenos comportamentos revelam sobre a psicologia humana profunda? Se você está aqui, sentindo que essas informações estão abrindo sua mente para novas formas de entender comportamento, eu quero que você deixe um comentário aqui embaixo. Pode ser algo simples como: "Eu nunca tinha pensado nisso dessa forma." Porque quando você compartilha essa percepção, você não só valida sua própria jornada de aprendizado, você também cria espaço para outras pessoas reconhecerem esses padrões em suas próprias vidas. Comentar é um ato de participação ativa no aprendizado coletivo. Então vai lá, me conta qual desses fatos mais te surpreendeu até agora. E deixa eu continuar revelando mais camadas dessa psicologia fascinante. Here's one that's going to validate something you probably already know, but society keeps telling you is wrong. People who swear a lot are usually more honest, more intelligent, and have better pain tolerance than people who don't swear. This flies completely in the face of what we've been taught about profanity being a sign of poor vocabulary or lack of intelligence, but the research is absolutely clear on this. Studies in psycholinguistics have shown that people who swear frequently actually have larger overall vocabularies than people who don't. They're not swearing because they can't think of other words. They're swearing because they're choosing the word that most accurately expresses the intensity and authenticity of what they're feeling. Swear words carry emotional weight that polite language doesn't have. They're taboo, which gives them power. When you use a swear word, you're breaking a social rule, and that transgression signals that what you're expressing is important enough to warrant rule breaking. Research has also found that people who swear more score higher on tests of honesty and lower on measures of deceptiveness. There's something about swearing that correlates with other forms of authenticity and straight talk. People who never swear, who always police their language to remain appropriate and acceptable, are often also policing other forms of authentic expression. They're performing respectability, managing impressions, prioritizing how they're perceived over how they actually feel. This doesn't mean swearing is always appropriate, or that people who don't swear are dishonest. Context matters enormously. But it does mean we should stop pathologizing swearing as a sign of poor character or limited intelligence. And here's something fascinating about pain tolerance. Multiple studies have shown that swearing actually increases your ability to withstand pain. When people are allowed to swear while experiencing pain, they can tolerate it longer and report lower pain intensity than when they're required to use neutral words. This is called pain offset swearing, and it works because swearing activates the amygdala and triggers a fight-or-flight response that includes natural pain relief mechanisms. So the next time you stub your toe and let out a string of profanity, you're not being crude. You're engaging in an evolutionarily adaptive pain management strategy. Let's talk about something that feels deeply personal and often confusing. If someone appears in your dreams repeatedly, especially someone you don't think about consciously very often, this isn't necessarily because you're in love with them, or because they're thinking about you, despite what pop psychology and spiritual Instagram accounts might tell you. Dreams are your brain's way of processing emotions, consolidating memories, and working through unresolved psychological material. When someone appears in your dreams, they're often functioning as a symbol rather than representing themselves literally. They might embody a quality you're grappling with, a type of relationship dynamic you're trying to understand, or an aspect of yourself that you've projected onto them. If you dream about an ex repeatedly, it's usually not because you want them back. It's because they represent something unresolved in your psyche, maybe a pattern you haven't healed, a part of yourself you abandoned in that relationship, or a lesson you haven't fully integrated. If you dream about someone you barely know, they might represent a potential version of yourself or a path you're considering. If you dream about someone you're angry with, your subconscious might be working through that anger, processing it so you can let it go. The emotional tone of the dream matters more than the person's literal presence. Are you feeling safe or threatened? Empowered or helpless? Connected or abandoned? These emotional themes are what your psyche is actually working with, and the person in the dream is just the character your brain has chosen to represent those themes. From a Jungian perspective, every person in your dream is actually an aspect of yourself. The angry father figure is your inner critic. The nurturing friend is your capacity for self-compassion. The mysterious stranger is your unexplored potential. This doesn't mean dreams are meaningless or that you should ignore them, but it does mean you should interpret them symbolically and emotionally rather than literally. Here's a big one that reveals so much about boundaries, self-awareness, and attachment wounds. If someone overshares everything, if they tell you their entire life story within the first few conversations, if they have no filter between their inner experience and what they express to relative strangers, they're often revealing several possible psychological patterns. First, they might have grown up in an environment with no boundaries, where privacy wasn't respected and everything was everyone's business. So they never learned the skill of emotional discernment, of gauging what's appropriate to share and with whom. Second, they might be desperate for connection and validation, and they've learned that vulnerability and disclosure sometimes create a sense of instant intimacy. So they lead with their most intimate information, hoping it will make people feel close to them quickly. Third, they might be anxiously attached and using oversharing as a test, flooding you with information to see if you'll stay or run, essentially asking, "Can you handle all of me right away, or are you going to abandon me like everyone else?" Fourth, they might have poor self-awareness and not realize that what they're sharing is inappropriate or making others uncomfortable. And fifth, they might actually be engaging in a subtle form of manipulation, using vulnerability as currency to create a sense of obligation or to position themselves as the victim or the fascinating wounded soul in the relationship. The tricky thing about oversharing is that it often masquerades as authenticity and vulnerability, and in a culture that's learned to value these traits, it can be hard to recognize oversharing as the boundary violation it often is. Real intimacy is built gradually, with increasing levels of disclosure that match the increasing levels of trust and safety in a relationship. When someone dumps their entire psychological history on you immediately, they're skipping steps, and that creates a false sense of closeness that isn't actually built on a foundation of real knowing and trust. If you're someone who tends to overshare, it's worth exploring what you're really seeking when you do this. Are you testing people? Are you trying to fast-track intimacy because you're afraid of the slow build? Are you confusing disclosure with connection? The healing work involves learning to develop relationships slowly, to tolerate the discomfort of not being fully known immediately, to build trust through consistent presence rather than through dramatic vulnerability. Let me share something that seems trivial, but actually reveals important things about impulse control and emotional regulation. If someone cooks while hungry, if they can't wait until the food is done and keep snacking on ingredients or eating things while they're preparing a meal, they're demonstrating what psychologists call present bias, the tendency to prioritize immediate gratification over delayed rewards even when the delayed reward would be better. This is the same psychological mechanism that underlies procrastination, addiction, financial problems, and many self-destructive behaviors. When you're hungry, your blood sugar is low, and this affects your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for executive function, impulse control, and long-term planning. Studies have shown that hungry people make worse decisions across the board, not just about food, but about everything. They're more impulsive, more present-focused, less able to delay gratification, and more likely to choose smaller immediate rewards over larger delayed ones. This is why you should never go grocery shopping when you're hungry. You'll make impulsive choices that your future self will regret. But there's a deeper layer here. People who consistently can't wait for food to be ready before eating, who can't tolerate the discomfort of hunger for even 20 minutes while they cook, are often revealing a broader pattern of difficulty tolerating discomfort or delaying gratification. This might come from childhood experiences of scarcity, where food was unpredictable, and you learned to eat whenever food was available because you didn't know when you'd get more. Or it might come from a broader difficulty with emotional regulation. using food as a way to immediately soothe any discomfort, rather than sitting with the feeling. The ability to delay gratification, to tolerate temporary discomfort in service of a better outcome, is one of the most important predictors of success and well-being across multiple life domains. Learning to wait for your food to be ready is a small but meaningful practice in building this capacity. If someone is always late, if they chronically run behind schedule and make people wait for them, this is rarely about time management skills and almost always about something deeper. Chronic lateness can reveal several different psychological patterns. For some people, it's a passive-aggressive expression of anger or resistance, a way of saying, "You can't control me," or "My time is more valuable than yours," without having to say it directly. For others, it's a form of anxiety avoidance, where the person delays leaving because they're anxious about the destination or the interaction, so they procrastinate and then arrive late. For others still, it's a manifestation of ADHD or executive function difficulties, where time blindness and difficulty with transitions make it genuinely hard to estimate how long things take and to shift from one activity to another. And for some people, chronic lateness is actually about attention and significance. Arriving late ensures that people notice your arrival, that there's a disruption when you enter, that you have impact and presence. People who are chronically late often don't realize or don't care about the message they're sending, which is that they don't value other people's time, that they expect others to accommodate them, that they believe the normal rules of social courtesy don't apply to them. Even when the lateness comes from anxiety or ADHD rather than selfishness, the impact on others is the same. It's disrespectful and frustrating. If you're someone who's always late, it's worth doing the psychological work to understand what's driving this pattern. Are you resisting something? Avoiding something? Seeking attention? Struggling with executive function? Once you understand the why, you can address the actual problem rather than just feeling guilty and promising to do better next time. Here's something subtle that reveals a lot about emotional processing and relational patterns. If someone gives you very long, detailed responses to simple questions, if you ask them how their day was and they give you a 20-minute narrative with backstory and context and tangential details, they're often revealing that they're understimulated in terms of connection and conversation in their daily life. They've been saving up these thoughts and observations with no one to share them with, so when they finally have an audience, it all comes pouring out. This is different from oversharing personal trauma. This is more about a hunger for being heard and witnessed in the mundane details of daily life. It can also indicate anxiety, where the person feels like they need to provide extensive context and justification for everything they say because they're afraid of being misunderstood or judged. Or it can indicate that they grew up in an environment where they weren't listened to, so now when someone does listen, they try to get everything out before the listening stops. People who do this often don't realize they're doing it, and they might feel hurt when others seem impatient or when conversations feel one-sided. The kind thing, if you're on the receiving end, is to gently let the person know that you care about them, but you need conversations to have more balance, more back and forth. And if you're someone who does this, it's worth exploring whether you have enough meaningful connection in your life and whether you're using conversations to meet needs that might be better met in other ways, like through therapy or journaling. If someone flinches when you move quickly near them, if they have an exaggerated startle response, if they jump at loud noises or sudden movements, they're almost certainly carrying trauma in their nervous system. This hypervigilance is a classic symptom of PTSD and complex trauma. Their nervous system has learned that the world is dangerous, that sudden movements or loud sounds can signal threat, so it's constantly scanning for danger and reacting to potential threats even when there's no real danger present. People with this kind of nervous system sensitivity often experience childhood abuse, domestic violence, combat trauma, or other experiences where their safety was genuinely threatened and they had to develop hypervigilance to survive. The tragic thing is that this survival mechanism that kept them safe in a dangerous environment continues to fire even in safe environments, making it hard for them to relax, trust, or feel truly at ease. If someone in your life has this startle response, please be patient with them. Move slowly and predictably around them. Give them warnings before you touch them, or enter their space. And understand that their nervous system is doing what it's been trained to do, protect them from danger that their body believes is still present. Se você está sentindo que este vídeo está revelando camadas de compreensão sobre comportamento humano que você nunca tinha considerado antes, deixa um like para eu saber que esse conteúdo está fazendo sentido. que vale a pena continuar explorando essas verdades psicológicas profundas. Cada like me mostra que você está realmente engajado com essa jornada de entender as pessoas, incluindo você mesmo, de uma forma muito mais profunda. If someone never posts on social media, if they're completely absent from Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, if they don't share their life online at all, this can mean several different things, and it's worth not jumping to conclusions. For some people, it's a healthy boundary, a recognition that social media is often performative and exhausting, and that they'd rather invest their energy in real-life connections. For others, it's social anxiety or a fear of being perceived, a discomfort with being visible that might point to shame or low self-worth. For others still, it's a reaction to past experiences of being surveilled or stalked, or having their information used against them. So they've chosen privacy as a form of protection. And for some people, it's actually a sign of depression, where they don't feel like they have anything worth sharing, or they can't muster the energy to curate a social media presence. The key is to not pathologize either extreme. People who never post aren't necessarily hiding something or being antisocial, and people who post constantly aren't necessarily narcissistic or attention-seeking. Social media use exists on a spectrum, and different levels work for different people based on their personality, values, and life circumstances. If someone remembers tiny details about you, if they bring up something you mentioned months ago in passing, if they notice when you've changed your hair, or when you seem off, even when you're trying to hide it, they're showing you that you matter to them. Memory is selective. We remember what we pay attention to, and we pay attention to what we care about. When someone encodes details about you into their long-term memory, when they notice the small things, they're demonstrating investment and care. This is one of the most underrated forms of love. This quiet attention, this consistent noticing. It's easy to make grand gestures or say pretty words, but remembering that someone takes their coffee with oat milk and 1 sugar, that's intimacy. Noticing that they've been quieter than usual lately, that's attunement. Bringing up a story they told you 3 months ago, that's evidence that they hold you in their mind, even when you're not present. If someone in your life does this, recognize it as the gift it is. And if you want to show someone you care about them, start paying attention to the details, because being truly seen and remembered is one of the most fundamental human needs. If someone apologizes constantly, if they say sorry for things that aren't their fault or don't require apology, if they apologize for taking up space or having needs or existing in a way that might inconvenience anyone, they're carrying trauma from an environment where they were blamed for things beyond their control. This pattern develops in childhood when a child is held responsible for adults' emotions, when anything that goes wrong somehow becomes the child's fault, when apology is the only way to restore peace or avoid punishment. The child's nervous system learns that preemptive apology is a survival strategy, a way to make yourself small and unthreatening, a way to ward off anger or rejection. Over-apologizing is profoundly linked to shame and low self-worth. When you apologize for existing, for having needs, for taking up space, you're revealing a core belief that your presence is burdensome, that you need to constantly atone for the sin of being human. This pattern is especially common in people who grew up with narcissistic or emotionally immature parents, people who were scapegoated, people who experienced emotional abuse. The healing isn't about just stopping the apologizing. It's about addressing the underlying belief that you're fundamentally too much or not enough, that you don't have the same right to exist and have needs that everyone else has. If someone can't accept compliments, if they immediately deflect or minimize or argue when you say something nice about them, they're revealing deep discomfort with positive attention, and possibly a core belief that they're unworthy of praise. This often develops when compliments in childhood were conditional, rare, or followed by criticism. Maybe you were praised, and then immediately told not to get a big head. Maybe compliments came with strings attached. Maybe you learned that accepting praise meant you were arrogant or conceited. So you developed this reflex of deflecting compliments to stay safe, to avoid the vulnerability of believing something good about yourself that might be taken away. The inability to receive compliments gracefully is actually a form of rejecting connection. Because when someone compliments you, they're offering you a gift of recognition. And when you deflect it, you're essentially telling them their perception is wrong, which shuts down the moment of connection they were trying to create. If someone needs constant reassurance, if they repeatedly ask if you're mad at them, or if everything is okay, or if you still love them, they're almost certainly carrying anxious attachment wounds. This pattern develops when early caregivers were inconsistent, sometimes available and loving and sometimes withdrawn or angry with no clear pattern that the child could predict. The child's nervous system never learned to trust that love is stable, that connection is secure, that people will stay even when they're upset. So the adult constantly seeks reassurance, trying to manage the anxiety of uncertainty by getting explicit confirmation that everything is okay. The problem is that reassurance only works temporarily. No amount of reassurance can fill the hole left by early inconsistency. The person will feel better for a moment, and then the anxiety will return, and they'll need reassurance again. The healing work involves learning to self-soothe, to tolerate uncertainty, to build secure attachment through consistent experience over time, rather than through constant verbal reassurance. If someone ghosts people, if they disappear from relationships without explanation, if they can't handle conflict or difficult conversations so they just vanish, they're using avoidance as a coping strategy, and they're likely carrying avoidant attachment wounds. This pattern often develops when expressing needs or emotions in childhood led to punishment, rejection, or emotional flooding from caregivers who couldn't handle the child's feelings. The child learns that it's safer to shut down, to leave, to avoid conflict entirely, rather than risk the vulnerability of staying and working through difficulty. Ghosting feels like self-protection to the person doing it, but it's actually a form of emotional violence to the person being ghosted, leaving them with no closure, no understanding, just abandonment and confusion. If someone is extremely private, if they never share what they're going through even with close friends, if they seem to have walls up that nobody can penetrate, they're often protecting themselves from vulnerability because vulnerability has been used against them in the past. Maybe they shared something personal and it was weaponized in an argument. Maybe they were mocked for their feelings. Maybe they were betrayed when they trusted someone. So they learned that keeping everything inside is safer than risking exposure. The cost of this protection is loneliness and disconnection, because intimacy requires vulnerability. And if you never let anyone see you, you never get to experience being truly known and loved. If someone gives gifts excessively, if they're always buying things for people or going overboard on occasions, they might be trying to earn love or prove their worth through material means. This often develops when affection in childhood was conditional on performance or achievement, when love had to be earned rather than freely given. The child learns that their inherent value isn't enough, that they need to do something or give something to deserve care and attention. This translates into adult relationships where the person unconsciously believes they need to purchase affection, that their presence alone isn't valuable enough. If someone is always busy, if they never have time to rest or be still, if their calendar is packed with commitments and activities, they might be running from something internal. Busyness can be a socially acceptable form of avoidance, a way of never having to sit with uncomfortable thoughts or feelings, never having to confront existential questions or unprocessed emotions. If you're always doing, you never have to face being. The culture celebrates busyness as productivity, but often it's just a sophisticated form of numbing. If someone makes self-deprecating jokes constantly, if they're always putting themselves down in ways that are framed as humor, they're often doing one of two things. Either they're beating others to the punch, criticizing themselves before anyone else can because that feels like control, or they're genuinely expressing self-hatred in the only way that feels socially acceptable. Real self-deprecating humor, the healthy kind, is occasional and genuinely playful. But constant self-criticism disguised as jokes is usually a sign of deep shame and low self-worth that needs to be addressed, not laughed off. If someone never asks for help, if they struggle alone even when support is available, if they pride themselves on handling everything independently, they're often carrying beliefs about help being weakness or about people being fundamentally unreliable. This hyper-independence usually develops when asking for help in childhood led to disappointment, criticism, or increased vulnerability. The child learns that depending on others is dangerous, that they can only trust themselves, that needing people makes them weak. So they build walls of self-sufficiency that look like strength, but actually prevent the deep interdependence that healthy relationships require. If someone is perfectionistic, if nothing they do is ever good enough, if they obsess over details and beat themselves up for small mistakes, they're usually trying to earn worth through achievement because they don't believe they have inherent value. Perfectionism is not about excellence or high standards, it's about fear. Fear that if you're not perfect, You'll be rejected, abandoned, exposed as the fraud you secretly believe you are. It's an exhausting way to live, constantly performing, never resting, never feeling like you've done enough. E se você está aqui, reconhecendo esses padrões, não só em outras pessoas, mas em você mesmo, sentindo essas verdades psicológicas ressoarem dentro de você, de uma forma que é ao mesmo tempo desconfortável e libertadora, saiba que você não está sozinho nessa jornada de autoconhecimento profundo. Esse canal existe exatamente para isso, para criar um espaço onde podemos explorar os padrões psicológicos que moldam o comportamento humano, onde podemos entender não só o que as pessoas fazem, mas por que fazem, onde podemos começar a ver com compaixão tanto os outros quanto a nós mesmos. Toda semana eu trago conteúdos novos sobre psicologia, comportamento humano, trauma, cura e todas essas verdades fascinantes que a maioria das pessoas nunca para analisar. Se você quer continuar nessa jornada de compreensão mais profunda, se inscreve no canal e ativa o sininho. Não é só sobre assistir vídeos, é sobre desenvolver uma forma completamente nova de ver e entender o comportamento humano, incluindo o seu próprio. E agora, vamos continuar explorando esses padrões reveladores. If someone changes their appearance drastically, if they suddenly dye their hair a completely different color, or get a dramatic haircut, or change their style entirely, they're often going through an internal transformation and using external change as a way to market or facilitate it. Hair is deeply tied to identity, and changing it dramatically is often about shedding an old self or claiming a new one. This is especially common after breakups, trauma, or major life transitions. The external change is a visible marker of internal shifts that might not be visible otherwise. If someone talks about their exes constantly, if every story somehow circles back to a previous relationship, they're not over it yet, period. It doesn't matter if they're talking positively or negatively, the fact that the ex still occupies so much mental and conversational space means there's unfinished emotional business. People who have genuinely moved on don't need to constantly reference or process their past relationships. The ex has been integrated into their history without remaining an active presence in their present. If someone is always negative, if they complain constantly and see problems in everything, they're often depressed or carrying so much unprocessed pain that it colors their entire perception of reality. Chronic negativity isn't a personality trait. It's a symptom. Behind the complaints is usually someone who's suffering and who's learned that complaining is the only way they know to express that suffering or to connect with others, through shared frustration. The healing requires addressing the underlying pain, not just trying to be more positive. If someone is extremely agreeable, if they never express preferences or opinions, if they just go along with whatever everyone else wants, they're often fawning, which is a trauma response. Fawning means abandoning your own needs and desires to keep others happy, to avoid conflict, to ensure you're not rejected or abandoned. People who fawn learned early that their needs didn't matter or that expressing them led to punishment. So they developed this pattern of constant accommodation and self-abandonment. If someone needs to win every argument, if they can't let things go or admit when they're wrong, they're usually operating from a fragile ego that equates being wrong with being worthless. For these people, arguments aren't about finding truth or understanding. They're about maintaining their sense of self-worth, which is dependent on always being right, always being the smartest person in the room, never showing vulnerability or imperfection. This rigidity makes real intimacy impossible, because intimacy requires the ability to be wrong, to be corrected, to not know everything. If someone is obsessed with productivity, if they measure their worth by their output, if they feel guilty whenever they're resting, they've internalized capitalism's message that your value is determined by what you produce. This is particularly common in high-achieving individuals who received love and praise conditionally, based on their accomplishments. They learned that they're only valuable when they're producing, so rest feels like failure and self-care feels like laziness. If someone hoards things, if they can't throw anything away, if their space is cluttered with items they never use, they're often trying to fill an emotional void with physical objects, or they're holding on to the past, because letting go feels like losing something they can't afford to lose. Hoarding is rarely about the objects themselves. It's about what they represent: security, memory, connection, potential, or simply the terror of emptiness. If someone needs the last word in every conversation, if they can't let a discussion end without making one final point, They're usually struggling with control and needing to feel like they've won or been heard or had the final say. This often comes from childhood experiences of being silenced, dismissed, or overruled. So now they fight to ensure their voice isn't erased, even in mundane conversations where the stakes are actually quite low. If someone is always cold, if they're constantly wearing layers or complaining about temperature while everyone else is comfortable, they might have poor circulation, thyroid issues, or they might simply have a lower body weight and less insulation. But sometimes chronic coldness is also linked to anxiety and hypervigilance, where the nervous system is in a constant state of activation that affects body temperature regulation. If someone laughs at inappropriate times, if they giggle during serious conversations, or when someone is upset, they're usually experiencing anxiety and using laughter as a nervous system regulation strategy. It's not that they find the situation funny, it's that their body is trying to discharge the uncomfortable energy of the moment through laughter because it doesn't know what else to do with it. If someone collects things obsessively, if they have massive collections of specific items, they're often trying to create order and control in one area of life when other areas feel chaotic or overwhelming. Collections provide a sense of mastery, completion, and predictability that might be lacking in relationships or career or other life domains. If someone never makes eye contact, if they look away when speaking or listening, they might be on the autism spectrum. They might have social anxiety, or they might have experienced trauma where making eye contact was dangerous, or led to being seen in ways that felt threatening. Eye contact is culturally specific and neurodivergent people often find it overwhelming or unnecessary. So the assumption that lack of eye contact means dishonesty or disrespect is both ableist and culturally ignorant. If someone is always early, if they arrive 15 minutes before they need to be anywhere, if being late causes them significant anxiety, they're often managing anxiety through control. Being early is a way of ensuring nothing goes wrong, nothing is unpredictable, nothing is left to chance. It's also often linked to people-pleasing and the fear of disappointing others or being perceived negatively. If someone changes the subject when emotions come up, if they deflect or make jokes whenever a conversation gets deep, they're usually uncomfortable with emotional intimacy and vulnerability. This discomfort often comes from environments where emotions weren't safe to express, where vulnerability was punished or mocked, so they learn to keep things light and surface level to protect themselves. If someone is extremely organized, if everything in their life is color-coded and scheduled and in its place, they might simply enjoy order, or they might be managing anxiety through control. When internal experience feels chaotic, creating external order can provide a sense of calm and predictability. This becomes problematic only when the need for order becomes rigid and inflexible and prevents spontaneity or adaptability. If someone never shares pictures of their partner or family on social media, it might mean they're private, or it might mean they're compartmentalizing their life, or it might mean the relationship is troubled and they don't want to create a public record they'll have to explain later. Or it might mean absolutely nothing, because not everyone uses social media as a public diary of their relationships. Here's what all of these psychological facts point to. Human behavior is rarely random. Behind every pattern, every quirk, every habit, there's usually a psychological reason, often rooted in early experience, attachment history, trauma, or learned coping strategies. When you start seeing people through this lens, when you recognize that behavior is communication, that symptoms are solutions to earlier problems, that everyone is doing their best to survive and connect with the tools they were given, you develop compassion, not just for others but for yourself, because you start recognizing your own patterns, your own coping mechanisms, your own ways of protecting yourself that made sense once but might not serve you anymore. The point isn't to diagnose everyone around you, or to turn every interaction into a psychological analysis. The point is to develop curiosity and compassion, to recognize that we're all walking around carrying invisible histories, managing invisible wounds, trying to get our needs met in the best ways we know how. And when you see this, really see it, the world becomes less frustrating and more fascinating, less judgmental and more human. We're all just people, doing our best, carrying our stories, hoping to be seen and understood and loved despite our imperfections. And maybe that's the most important psychological fact of all.